words that simply say, you are an unceasing spiritual being with an eternal destiny in God's great universe.
My name is Greg Jessen, and I want to welcome you to the second session, which is an examination of the completion of Dallas Willard's book, The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. It's by these three, yes. And we have a kind of an amazing group of panelists here. They are three philosophers, each who earned his PhD at the University of Southern California under Dallas Willard. And now that's the thing that they all have in common. But I asked each of them if they would share one very interesting thing about their lives, which is non-philosophical. And I won't tell you which one it is, but one of them had a hard time thinking of anything because he said, well, everything is philosophical. But he finally came up with something. Aaron was a guitarist in a band, a rock and roll band, who did the lead-in for Air Supply and Eddie Money. There you go. Yeah. Which, by the way, Dallas Willard never even thought of doing. Okay, well, yours is interesting, yes. Ten Elsoff. His major focus these days is that he's raising chickens, but they are under attack from a raccoon. And so he spends about half the evenings waiting out in the dark for a raccoon to come by so he can capture it. And that's why he may look a bit tired. And then finally, Stephen Porter, he, as a young man, ran with the bulls in Pamplona, Spain. And if you look on YouTube, you can find Steve being run over by the bulls. And he's never quite been his philosophical self since. But what we're going to do is each of them, we're going to start with Steve. He's going to kind of lay out a program. But we're going to look at the challenges that they faced as they were completing Dallas's book, The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. I don't know if you have ever seen Dallas Willard's handwriting, but just merely that these guys were able to kind of decipher that handwriting is in itself, it's not a Class A miracle, but it is a Class B miracle. It's not up there with the resurrection, but it is a Class B miracle. So let's start with Steve.
Thanks, Greg. And Greg, too, was a student at USC and studied with Dallas. I'm just going to kind of frame our time here. So I'm going to explain a bit about how the three of us got involved and give what we're calling a final update of the book, Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. And then Greg's going to come up and give a synopsis of the central argument of the book. And then Aaron will talk about some of the implications that he sees of the book's argument for ethical theory and teaching moral knowledge. And then I'll come back up and talk just for a wee bit of time about some of the implications of the book's contents for spiritual formation, and then we'll have a time for questions. And there's no cowbells this session, so we're free of that. So one of the things to say about the final update of this book is that this book had its genesis in a strong sense that Jane Willard, who's with us today, that Jane had from the Lord after hearing Dallas lecture at Biola University on the redemption of reason back in 1998. And you can read in various places about Jane's sense that even though she was hoping Dallas would be done with book writing, she got the sincere sense that no, there was another book, and it was based on what Dallas was talking about in that lecture, The Redemption of Reason. And so in 1998, Dallas, at least in its inception, the book began, and it's now 2018. That's 20 years, and this June, in fact, Amazon now tells us that June 7th, the book Disappearance of Moral Knowledge will be published by Routledge Press. So Dallas's first academic book, Logic and the Objectivity of Knowledge, took 20 years to write. So I guess that's just how his academic books go. That's the good news. The book's coming out in June. The bad news is it's priced at over $160. Now, I need to tell you that's not our pricing, but, I have a picture of there it is. There's the book. Yeah. The big reveal. It's an academic book. It's hardcover, and academic books are often priced at this level. This one's particularly expensive because Routledge doesn't usually let their authors publish books that are 456 pages, which this one is. That beats Divine Conspiracy by 40 pages. So if you found Divine Conspiracy hard, buckle up. And so part of the reason why the book is so expensive is because it's so stinking thick. And Routledge has promised us that they will make a paperback version available in about a year or so's time, and we expect that to be far more affordable. Let me say a little bit about why Greg, Aaron, and I are involved with this. By 2011, Dallas had written a preface and the first 5 chapters of what he had clearly planned to be a 7-chapter book. He had circulated those first 5 chapters, and I think there are probably people in this room who saw those first 5 chapters, got feedback on them, and we found evidence that not only had Dallas gotten feedback on them, but he himself had revised those chapters and had entered a lot of those revisions into those first 5 chapters. But that same year, Dallas fell ill, as I'm sure many of you know, with what would eventually be diagnosed as pancreatic cancer, and work slowed for Dallas on all fronts as he dealt with surgery and chemotherapy and other treatments. And over those months, Becky and Jane provided email updates on Dallas's condition, and more than once it was mentioned in the emails that Dallas was burdened by not being able to get back to the book Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. So in the early days of May of 2013, I contacted Greg and Aaron. We were friends and colleagues at USC together, and I contacted Greg and Aaron. I said, what do you think about the 3 of us approaching Dallas and just offering ourselves as kind of research assistants, and we'll help him finish the book? I mean, we all had the impression that it was pretty close to being done, so we were imagining ourselves tracking down footnote references and things like this. And so Greg and Aaron, I went back and looked at all the old emails. That's kind of nice to do, and we went back and forth about how should we do it, and we don't want to be presumptive, and so we finally figured out what we thought was the best way to approach this. That should have been an indication that this was going to be slow going. Even our email to Becky to ask or to offer this took about 5 days. So. But I eventually sent an email, and I was in England at the time on a research leave, and so I was jet-lagged, and I wasn't able to sleep. And I remember, in fact, the email tells me it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I remember that night, this was 2 o'clock in the morning on May the 7th of 2013. I remember that night, I was awoken, and I was laying in bed. You know how it is when you're jet-lagged. You're thinking, should I lay here? Should I get up? I'm completely awake. What am I going to do? And I was laying there, and I had this distinct impression and this sense that I should email Becky now. And so I got up and I crafted an email to Becky Heatley Willard, and offered Greg and Aaron and myself as his research assistants. And Becky got that email shortly after I sent it, and she was able to talk to Dallas, and she actually sent this email to us, if you can see that. I can read it down here. This was Becky's email to us on May 7th, 2013. It was around the time, it's not up here, but the time was 10 p.m. on May 7th. Gentlemen, I've shared your offer with my father. He said, now they could actually do it. He seems quite relieved to know that you want to help make the book a reality. What a blessing this is for him at this time. Thank you. And, of course, none of us knew that 6 a.m., I think it was, the next day, Dallas passed away. And so now sometimes I've thought this must have been God's providence, but, of course, the 3 of us have sometimes wished maybe I would have waited a little bit longer on sending that email, and we would have had one less thing to do for the last 5 years. But shortly thereafter, Becky sent us all the extant chapters from Dallas's computer. And about was a month or so after Dallas's passing that we were invited up graciously by Jane and the family, and we came up to Dallas's home office in Chatsworth, and Greg, Aaron, and I spent the night up there, and we swam around. We kind of swam in Dallas's office for a day or two, and trying to find as much as we could of yellow legal pads with Dallas's writing on them. Thankfully, we had the first 5 chapters. And we had quite a bit of what we knew was Chapter 6, but Chapter 6 was unfinished, and there was a good chunk of what we knew Dallas intended to do in Chapter 6 that he hadn't done, and we never found anything further. It was quite clear that he stopped about midway through Chapter 6. And then we found 2 different starts of Chapter 7, what was then Chapter 7, what's now Chapter 8 in the book. 2 different starts, and the 2 different starts were quite different. One was, I think, about a 20-page start of Chapter 7, and the other was a 40 or so page start of Chapter 7, but they started quite differently. We also had a prospectus that Dallas had written of what that final chapter would include. So we had some work to do, and so we had a lot of decisions to make about how we wanted to help Dallas finish the book. We thought, again, we'd be helping him alongside him, so this wasn't exactly what we had in mind when we signed up for the task. And it was difficult to decide what to do. Ultimately, we decided we didn't want anything in this book that wasn't clearly Dallas's own words, or anything that wasn't Dallas's own words. We wanted to make sure it was clear that it was our words. And so most of the book, in fact, all the way through Chapter 5, we left those as is. The Chapter 6 is largely, or there are some significant parts of it that are Dallas's. And then we developed a convention somewhere in the middle of Chapter 6 where anything that's in our voice as editors is bold-faced. Am I getting this right?
It's whenever there's a mixture
Yes.
of us and Dallas, the smaller part is unbold, is in bold, and the larger part is.
See why it's difficult for me to remember exactly what this is. But we designated it, and Aaron explains that very well in our introduction. And so Chapter 6 actually turned into 2 chapters. Chapter 6 dealing with John Rawls's work in ethics, and the other, Chapter 7, dealing with Alistair McIntyre's work. And then, so now what is now Chapter 8, which was Dallas's positive view, we were able to bring together various chapters Dallas had written, some unpublished papers that he had written, and there's probably about 4 or 5 different sources that we were able to kind of bring together and weave together in such a way that the final chapter certainly isn't all of what Dallas would have wanted it and intended it to be, but it's entirely Dallas's own words, and it's a mixture of different things he wrote on the disappearance of moral knowledge and the recovery of moral knowledge. So that's in a nutshell kind of how we got involved and our process. And now I'm going to turn it over to Greg, and he's going to give a brief synopsis of the argument of the book.
Thanks, Steve. It's hard to believe that was 5 years ago. It's fun to relive some of that early memory of this process. So as Steve said, in 1998, just after the publication of Divine Conspiracy, Dallas turned his long-term research efforts to the disappearance of moral knowledge. And as many of you will know, when Dallas talked about the disappearance of moral knowledge, he didn't mean to suggest that moral knowledge had disappeared in the sense that it had gone out of existence or nobody had it. In fact, Dallas was convinced that the average person had quite a bit of moral knowledge. They knew quite a bit about good and evil, right and wrong, and so forth. So moral knowledge hadn't gone out of existence. Rather, Dallas used the language of disappearance to describe a particular and dramatic shift in social facts over the course of 100 years or so. Here's how he describes the shift in Knowing Christ Today. This is a quote. Over a period of time, less than a century, the knowledge institutions of our society ceased, for various causes and reasons, to represent traditionally recognized moral values and principles as constituting a body of knowledge. They took it to be an area in which knowledge was not possible, or not possible to the extent that it could be taught as knowledge. This is the disappearance of moral knowledge that has actually occurred in our recent past. Now, Dallas thought that this disappearance was a disaster for society. Moral judgments, once grounded in a socially and institutionally endorsed body of knowledge, and supportable, at least in principle, by means of argument and reason, had fallen to the purview of feeling, or perhaps worse, public policy. As a result, reason, rationality, argument, things like that, once thought essential in the guidance of moral judgment, had been replaced with things like charisma, or the capacity to affect the way people feel, or maybe worse, just the raw exercise of power. With the loss of a publicly recognizable body of moral knowledge is also lost, he thought, the possibility of public debate over good and evil, right and wrong, or at any rate, public debate governed by traditional rules of inference and rationality. All that's left to guide public moral discourse is strength of feeling, and for those who have it, the power to enforce the dictates of those feelings. And I sometimes wonder whether Dallas, way back in 1998, could foresee just the degree to which that would be true today when we think about our political discourse and the like. A little later in Knowing Christ Today, Dallas recognizes what he takes to be four major causes of this disappearance. And here I quote again. First, there's the failure of the church to guide the development of modern societies into the way of Jesus. Second, there's the failure of modern thinkers and scholars to find a secular basis for Christian moral principles. Third, there's the emergence of many moralities at the hands of anthropological research. And fourth, there's the disappearance of the human self at the hands of advances in psychology, end quote. It's a second of these causes that takes center stage in the book, The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. Among the causes, again, of the disappearance was a protracted philosophical failure. It was a protracted philosophical failure that contributed to the disappearance. It was a failure to provide an adequate philosophical account of knowledge in the moral domain. Or put differently, a metaphysical and epistemological framework that could accommodate and account for established knowledge of good, evil, right, and wrong. So the book is largely given over to a detailed treatment of those thinkers that Dallas thought contributed most to this protracted philosophical failure. The book is a long and detailed story of philosophical failure, together with a chapter at the end about how to sort of recover from the failure. So here then is an irresponsibly quick summary of the argument of the book, and it really is, some of you, again, have seen chapter drafts, and so you'll know that trying to summarize even one of the chapters, much less the entire book, in a 6 or 7 minute talk is a fool's errand. In fact, when this session was being planned, I wish I had the email. I didn't bring the email. The email from Steve to Aaron and I outlined the jobs we would all have for the time. And it was, I'll introduce, Aaron will talk about pedagogy, Greg, you'll summarize the book, and then in parentheses it says, have fun, bro. So this is me having fun, I guess. Okay, so here goes. After an introduction to the disaster, which is the disappearance of moral knowledge, the book you can think of as unfolding in 4 episodes, each describing a crucial step in the progression toward this current state where there's no publicly recognized body of moral knowledge. The first episode, which is really just the backdrop for the book, in the first episode, the church lost its credibility as a repository of moral knowledge, and there were a lot of causes and reasons for the church having lost its epistemic authority, but it did. And this gave rise to the need for a science of ethics, a secular grounding for moral knowledge, one that didn't depend on the authority of the church. So then in the second episode, the most influential attempts to provide this secular grounding for moral knowledge rendered the moral domain non-natural, something set apart from the natural world. The most notable efforts to develop this body of common moral knowledge could be found in variations on Kantian-inspired idealism and in hedonistic utilitarianisms, such as those of Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Henry Sidgwick. These two streams of thought, the Kantian and the utilitarian, one emphasizing roughly the sources of action and the other the outcomes, ran more or less parallel to one another through much of the 19th century until they culminated, respectively, in the work of T.H. Green and F.H. Bradley on the Kantian side, and the utilitarianism of G.E. Moore on the other. Most importantly for the story that Dallas tells, G.E. Moore's ethical theory all comes to rest on one particular property which is far removed from ordinary experience, called the good, a property that things could have called the good. And given the prevailing early 20th century attitudes about what could and couldn't be counted as a science, indeed what could and couldn't be known, this dislocation of the primary subject matter for ethics away from the natural all but guaranteed the perceived failure of attempts to develop a science of ethics. Non-naturalism, Dallas argues, would soon collapse under the force of a burgeoning ideology of science that expressed itself in the logical positivist criterion of meaningful concepts and statements. Under this criterion, moral judgments couldn't possibly be cognitive, for the cognitive was restricted to what is verifiable in sense perception. The project to establish a science on a non-natural property was doomed to failure given the prevailing ideas of the time. So this failure to establish a science of ethics gave rise to the third, and what I think is the most depressing episode in the story. The episode is given over to the development of non-cognitivist theories of the meaning of moral language. Here is expressly abandoned the attempt to ground moral distinctions in a body of knowledge concerning how things really are, either in a natural or in some other non-natural domain. And what's offered in the place of this attempt to develop a systematic body of moral knowledge is an attempt to explain what we're doing when we use moral language. So instead of developing a theory of moral properties, the attention was turned to how we use moral language. Perhaps we're just emoting when we use moral language. We're giving expression to emotional experience. Or maybe we're prescribing conduct for ourselves or for others. What we're decidedly not doing is ascribing moral properties, natural or otherwise, to actions or to persons. In this episode, logic, rationality, cogent inference, traditionally understood, and the like, are rendered irrelevant to moral discourse, since that discourse doesn't express truth-bearing propositional content. Expressions of emotion like hooray, or prescriptions like go wash my car, are neither true nor false. If you were taking a true-false test and you came across, number 4, hooray, true or false, you wouldn't know what to say. They don't admit of being true or false, so they can't meaningfully appear either as premises or conclusions in an instance of rational inference traditionally understood. So moral discourse was more or less thoroughly divorced from rational inquiry. That's the third episode. The fourth and final episode in the story is driven by a kind of widespread dissatisfaction with this divorce of moral discourse from logic, rationality, cogent inference, and the like. Surely it was thought our moral judgments must admit of rational assessment and grounding. There has to be a way to rationally assess our moral judgments. So the final episode is given over to the development of a kind of logic or a kind of rationality that can be applied to moral discourse even in the absence of a domain of moral properties, natural or otherwise, out there to be discovered. Right? So it's an attempt to recover rationality without going back to this idea that there are moral properties out there to be discovered. John Rawls and Alistair McIntyre feature prominently in this episode of the story, insofar as they attempt to ground moral knowledge and the relevant species of rationality in real or ideal social conditions. The normative distinctions that make up the ethical life arise not in connection with discoverable properties of persons or acts, but rather in connection with certain real or ideal social conditions. For example, agreements between ideal observers of one kind or another. If you know anything about Dallas's views, you'll know that he didn't think this recharacterization of logic and rationality could do justice to the moral domain. Social agreements and conditions, ideal or otherwise, just don't give rise to the kind of normativity that we all recognize and experience in the ethical dimensions of human existence. The fact that some group or other, however ideal, has agreed that something ought to be the case doesn't account for the sense of obligation that we feel when we feel moral obligation. So then in the final chapter of the book, and this is the happy chapter, the rest of it is a story of failure. In the final chapter of the book, Willard draws on two 20th century ethical thinkers, Emanuel Levinas and Knut Logstrup, to sketch a way forward in the direction of recovering a philosophically grounded and institutionally recognizable body of moral knowledge. Chief among the correctives in these two thinkers are these two suggestions. First, that we have a sustained focus and sustained attention on the good person as the primary topic in ethics, not some abstract quality called the good, and certainly not moral language. Those were, it was a mistake to think of those kinds of things as the primary subject matter for ethics. Rather, we should focus on the good person as the primary topic. And second, sustained focus on and attention to the ethical demands and obligations that arise in face-to-face, concrete, individual, personal relationships, as opposed to thinking in abstractions, thinking about abstract principles or perfectly general rules. Attention is given to the experience of moral obligation in the often very ordinary experiences that we have with other people. So attention to the good person and attention to our experience of morality in everyday face-to-face interactions. So careful attention to and description of the experience we all share of the ethical demand in the face of the other gives us the basic distinctions and concepts from which a systematic body of knowledge can be developed. It's here in the real and very often very ordinary encounter with our neighbor that we discover the ethical demand. What we discover here can be articulated in propositions, propositions about the nature of the good person and about the various goods of human life toward which the good person's life is oriented. And Aaron will have more to say about those dimensions of this chapter. These propositions, as propositions now, can be true or false. Unlike a statement like hooray or go wash my car, the propositions here are capable of being true or false. They can have implications. They can be supported or refuted with reasons, and they can be developed in such a way as to be publicly, maybe even institutionally promoted and taught. And so they offer the possibility, at least, of the reappearance of moral knowledge in our teaching institutions. The book leaves us then with that hopeful possibility, and again, Aaron will have more to say about what that might look like in detail. Thank you.
Hello, folks. Haven't been in front of a crowd this large since my band days, I must confess. That's right, thank goodness, yeah. I told Dallas when we started getting the gigs with some of these recognizable bands, and he looked at me and said, "Oh, that's nice." Clearly had no idea who these people were. I'm going to talk about the implications for moral theory and for teaching moral knowledge of the argument of Dallas's book. I have to say here that when we're talking about moral theory and the teaching of moral knowledge, we're talking about this mainly in an academic context. This is an academic book. It's aimed at primarily at academics, and the kinds of recommendations that Dallas is making there are primarily for academics, especially philosophers, teaching ethical theory. There are, of course, some lessons that we can extrapolate for other contexts, and Steve's going to be talking about that. So, but this portion of our presentation is mainly about the academic context. And I'm going to say that I think there are three main bodies of implication for ethical theory and for teaching it in an academic setting. And the first body of implications itself has three main parts. And they all kind of fall under, the first one is that we should reject certain misguided norms of 20th century analytic ethics. Now, analytic philosophy is a school of philosophy that became very prominent in English-speaking countries in the 20th century. It's the dominant school of philosophy, even to this day, in English-speaking countries. And it's mainly with this tradition that Dallas is interacting in the book. And so under the dominion of analytic philosophy, these three problematic norms developed in academic philosophy. The first is a turn to what's called metaethics. And the first thing Dallas, I think, would want to say is that we have to reject this metaethical turn by subordinating metaethics to first-order moral inquiry. Now, there's some philosophical jargon in there that I should probably explain. Metaethics, you can go to this next slide here. Metaethics is something like the background assumptions of what we'd normally think of as ethical theory. We probably, most of us in this room, would normally think of ethics as having to do with what's right, wrong, good, and bad. And traditionally, that has been the heart and the main point of ethical theory. But in the 20th century, you see this strange turn to background questions. And initially, the background questions that interested folks the most were these questions about moral language that Greg was just talking about a few moments ago. Do ethical claims have any meaning at all? Or are they meaningless? And if they do have meaning, how exactly does that work? Right? This whole sort of non-cognitivist approach that Greg was talking about fits in here. And the term metaethics was actually invented to describe or name what these folks who were preoccupied with moral language, with what they were doing. They clearly weren't doing ethics as it had traditionally been understood, but they were doing something that pertained to ethics, and so they started calling it metaethics. Over time, as philosophers in the analytic tradition have become less preoccupied with matters of language, the term metaethics has broadened its scope to include all kinds of background issues, things that you guys might be familiar with, like what's God's relationship to morality, the Euthyphro dilemma. Are good things good because God approves of them, or does God approve of them because they're intrinsically good? That would be a metaethical sort of question. Or questions about the objectivity and universality of moral truths, the problem of relativism. Those would all be considered metaethical problems today. But one of the things that happened in the course of the 20th century is that with the turn to language, there was this turn to metaethics. But even though we've turned away from our preoccupation with language, philosophy or philosophical ethics has still stayed pretty much metaethical. It has stayed on these kind of abstract questions that are background questions for more first-order questions about what's right, wrong, good, or bad. And we haven't really made a full disciplinary return to first-order moral inquiry in an effort to generate moral knowledge of the sort that you actually use in guiding your life. And so the first thing Dallas, I think, wants to say is that we have to reject this metaethical turn by subordinating those higher-order questions, those background questions, to the first-order questions of what's right, wrong, good, or bad. And this is actually a return to the traditional view of things in philosophical ethics. We've got this quote here from Aristotle, from the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle says, "The purpose of the present study of morality is not, as it is in other inquiries, the attainment of theoretical knowledge. We are not conducting this inquiry in order to know what virtue is, but in order to become good, else there would be no point in studying it." And that's exactly what Dallas believed. The second sort of point under the first main set of implications is that we have to reject the term to quandary ethics by focusing on what people need to know in order to be and to do good in the course of ordinary human life. That's first-order ethics right there, right? Now, this term quandary ethics, it's not one that Dallas uses in the book. I didn't know him to use it, but I think it's a term that was introduced by another philosopher named Edmund Pincoffs in the 1970s, and I like this term. It's a good name for the preoccupation with kind of dilemma cases and philosophical puzzles in ethics. You guys might have heard of the trolley problem. Anyone ever hear of the trolley problems? Suppose that you see a trolley rushing down the track. It's a runaway trolley, and it's heading for 5 workmen on the track ahead. Next to you is a switch. If you throw the switch, you can divert the trolley along another track where there's only one person working. So should you flip the switch or not, right? This is a puzzle case, right? A dilemma case where there's been a lot of philosophical attention given to it. A similar case has to do with if you have a lifeboat with limited space, who should you put in the lifeboat and who should you leave out of the lifeboat and so on. So these kinds of cases. One of the things that Dallas talks about in the book is the fact that as philosophical ethics started to emerge from its preoccupation with moral language and start to try to move a little bit back in the direction of applied ethics or first-order moral inquiry, it remained focused on these disagreement cases, right? Disagreement and its resolution was the real aim of ethical theory, as opposed to asking general questions about what does a good life look like and what kinds of things should you do to become a good person, which is ultimately what Dallas thinks that ethics should be about, right? So disagreement and its resolution become the focus of ethics after it starts to leave metaethics a little bit behind. And I think that's getting pretty close to what Pinkoff's called quandary ethics. And there's a great passage here from the Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. This is Dallas writing here, where he talks about this. He says, marginal issues, lifeboat cases, and the finer points of conceptual distinction are interesting exercises and have a point for philosophical training. But it's not empirically confirmable, to say the least, that the chances of being a good person improve with philosophical training in ethical theory, as that has mainly been understood. We do not have to know what the person would do in a lifeboat situation to know whether or not they have goodwill, though what they do in such situations may throw light on who they are or how good or bad they are. The appropriate response to actions in extreme situations may not be a moral judgment at all, but one of pity or admiration, one of the tragic sense of life, or of amazement at what humans are capable of, etc. That last line there, I think, is really remarkable because it's basically saying that what philosophical ethics for the last half century approximately has been most preoccupied with after it left moral language behind and started to focus on these quandaries, they actually might not be suitable subject matter for ethics at all. Not just that these are peripheral matters, they might not belong to ethics at all. I think that's a remarkable suggestion. In any case, these things can't remain our focus. Dallas wants to say we need to start focusing on questions of first-order ethics about what to do on the days when you don't have to make hard decisions about runaway trolleys and who to save in the lifeboat, so on and so forth. The third sort of subpoint under rejecting these misguided norms of analytic ethics is that we have to reject what Dallas calls the dialectical turn by aiming to construct a systematic body of moral knowledge focusing on a common subject matter defined by a field of moral phenomena available to common experience. So this dialectical turn that Dallas talks about has to do with philosophy sort of turning in on itself and becoming a matter of ongoing internal critique where one person critiques the last person in line, and then the next person critiques that person, and so on and so forth. So it's sort of inward turn in philosophy. It's not dealing with ethical issues of ordinary life anymore. He's got this nice quotation here where he explains what he means. He says, after Moore, 20th century, that's G.E. Moore that Greg talked about, 20th century ethical theory becomes predominantly, perhaps even essentially dialectical. That is to say, the proposal and adoption of positions in ethical theory become primarily a matter of fixing up perceived failures of previous theories, not a matter of something done on the basis of examination of a field of phenomena that is open to examination by all theories and thinkers alike. This dialectical character of 20th century ethical theories is driven, I think, by a prevailing assumption that no common field of ethical phenomena is accessible to the inquirers. That means that the aspirations of a given theorist must be limited to the correcting of errors detected in previous theories on the basis of his or her own creative constructions. So the solution to the problem then, Dallas thinks, is to point us toward a field of ethical phenomena that we can all directly encounter in experience and use that as a kind of common ground to come together around a communal project of recovering ethical knowledge. And the phenomenon that he mainly points us to here, that's supposed to be now the subject matter of ethics, and this is the second big implication of Dallas's view, is that we are to adopt the good person as the central subject matter for ethics. He says, we all know good people. He doesn't think that good people are especially rare, right? He's not only pointing us here toward moral exemplars like Socrates, Jesus, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King, although they would certainly fit in here, but he thinks that we all know good people in our ordinary lives, neighbors, relatives, and so on, who would stand out as worthy of admiration and worthy of emulation. And he thinks that these are the folks that we need to look very, very closely at as we try to build up a body of moral knowledge. And the way you do that is, first of all, by identifying clear cases of good persons. And this is an interesting move that he makes here. He thinks that we all are able to do this just on the basis of natural attitudes that emerge as we interact with people. He thinks that there are certain people that naturally evoke for us attitudes of admiration, for example. And this is how we are to identify good people. And once we've done that, once we have our set of good people for examination, then we can start to compare and contrast them a little bit, look for key features that they might have in common, and develop a list of attributes, a kind of catalog of attributes of a good person, as well as what he calls useful general descriptions of what good people are like. And moral knowledge, then, is basically going to consist in these general descriptions of what good people are like, along with the open-ended catalog of attributes that they seem to have in common and seem to be important to their being good persons. Now here's Dallas's description. He actually gets started on this project to give us some examples of what this might look like. And so he gives us this useful general description of the good person. He says, good people are individuals who are intent upon advancing the various goods of human life with which they are effectively in contact in a manner that respects the relative degrees of importance of those goods and the extent to which their actions can actually promote the existence and maintenance of those goods. And that's kind of a mouthful, kind of a lot to wrap your mind around, but he's basically talking about someone here who is committed to doing the best they can with the goods that are available to them within the limits of their own power, right? So what can I do to sort of maintain and or increase the amount of good in the world, given my context, my setting, and the limits of my own power? And that's what a good person is for Dallas. And then he starts to list some of their key features. He says, the good person treats those immediately around him and herself with respect and care. Now, this is where Levinas and Logstrup come in, because they were both focused on the immediate experience of other people and the way in which they sort of cry out to us just by their being there for respect and for care. And he thought that their analyses of this fundamental moral experience of the encounter with the other was right on. And this is the sort of heart of the moral life, as far as Dallas understood it. He says also the good person has some station in life, some role or roles specifying particular goods to be cared for. So this is anything from your position in a family, being a parent or a child or a sibling, to your career, your position within your career. These are places to stand in the human social world from which you can begin to interact with some of the goods of human life. He also says the good person will be deeply committed to the recognition and full deployment of moral rights. So this is an extension of respect for other people, care for other people. The good person manifests a definite range of virtues, understood as acquired abilities to achieve some of the more important goods that issue around one. So there's a place for virtue theory as a kind of extension of Dallas's overall vision for moral, for a science of moral knowledge. He says also the good person is willing to learn how best to promote the existence and maintenance of the relevant goods. Right? So the good person is always willing to learn more and to learn how to do better at being a good person. It's kind of the Gregory of Nyssa point that you were making earlier, right? So open to getting bigger and better with regard to the good. And finally, the good person understands and appropriately conforms to moral laws, rules, and principles. publicly recognized moral principles are critically, not slavishly respected. So there's a recognition here that moral laws and principles are basically good things. They're supposed to make a positive contribution to human life, but at the same time, we don't want to look at these things the way, say, the Pharisees did. We don't want to be legalistic in our approach. And this is actually, although Dallas doesn't make the connection here, another very Aristotelian point that he's making. Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, argues that laws and rules are intrinsically defective because we always state them as if they were universally valid principles, but they never really are. They always have to be adjusted to the particulars of a situation. And so you have to have an intelligent and well-meaning person applying those rules in ways that make sense in particular contexts. So this is the sort of thing where, well, if Anne Frank is in your attic and the Gestapo comes to the door and asks you, do you have any Jews here, should you tell the truth? And hopefully, obviously, the answer is no, right? But people wonder about that, and so I think this is a case where Dallas would say, well, no, you can't just slavishly and blindly apply the rule. That's not characteristic of the good person. Okay, so the third main point, that was the second main implication. The third main implication of Dallas's view is that we're to exclude coercion, pressure, and even advocacy from moral pedagogy. And for me, I'm not sure if this is a point that transfers outside of the academic context for Dallas. Perhaps Steve can illuminate this for us. But Dallas basically makes the point that there is a widespread belief that moral instruction must inevitably take the form of obnoxious moralizing. And he thinks that this had a lot to do with the disappearance of moral knowledge in the 20th century. In fact, we might, the first point had to do with misguided norms of 20th century ethical theory. This might actually be a misguided norm of 19th century ethical theory, this sort of descent into obnoxious moralizing as a form of ethical instruction. And so Dallas makes a number of very strong statements about this in the book. He says, one of the most common mistakes in current views on teaching moral knowledge is that it essentially involves an effort to get people to do or to believe certain things. But this is no more true of teaching moral knowledge than of teaching arithmetical or other knowledge. And he says, our task as teachers is not to control behavior or belief, but to help students achieve understanding. And then also, the impartation of knowledge certainly requires an inward and uncoerced activity of exploration and comprehension for its realization. So not only do we not have to descend into obnoxious moralizing in order to teach morality, it's actually positively harmful to do so. It's not the task of the moral teacher, and it makes it impossible to learn moral knowledge in the right way. And Dallas took this so seriously that he said we shouldn't even advocate in the classroom for a particular moral position. He says, rarely, in my opinion, should a view of conduct or character be presented to students as one's own, except possibly in friendly conversation, and then only with great care. It's interesting. In light of these kinds of comments, I reflected back on my own experience with Dallas when I took his ethics classes as an undergraduate and then again as a graduate student. And I think he actually lived up to this. I'm not so sure he did in other classes. His metaphysics class, I came away from that pretty sure that he was a realist about universals and so on and so forth. But with regard to ethics, I think he actually did really pull himself back from advocacy in those kinds of cases. And so those are, as far as I can tell, the main implications for ethical theory and practice, at least in an academic setting, from Dallas's book. And I'll then hand it back over to Steve.
We're going to have a little time for questions, so if you want to try to make your way to the microphones here. I will start with the first question, and that is, here we are, we're 4 doctors of philosophy. This goes through all kinds of issues that each of us have shed tears over and many long, hard nights of work. But here we are also at a conference on experiencing life with God. So you can take this in almost any direction you want, but how do these studies of Dallas's relate to the question of experiencing life with God? Are these just mere academic studies, or is there some important insight here that could help us understand the question of living our lives with God? And take it in any direction. Here's the microphone.
Actually, let me do it here, because I'm going to, so this is part of what I was going to say, Greg. So let me just quickly go to this slide here. This is the definition that Aaron gave, but here's something from Knowing Christ Today, and I think Knowing Christ Today, Dallas has a chapter in that called The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge, where he connects a bit this. And so this quote, today, given the prevailing intellectual and cultural atmosphere, right, you are likely to pick up from your surroundings, with no special thought on your part, the conviction that there is no knowledge to be had of good and evil, no knowledge of God, and no divine presence in our world that enables us to transcend its merciless regularities. If that conviction settles in on you, you will live in terms of it and never enter the kingdom of God. And I think that's the connection, is if this conviction that there is no such thing as publicly accessible moral knowledge, if that settles in on us, and if it settles in on the culture, then the idea that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life just doesn't make any sense. How could he be the true way if there is no knowledge to be had about better and worse ways to live? So I think this point that Dallas is making is a fundamental one about understanding Jesus' message in a way that is actually inviting to people, where it makes sense as an invitation.
Do you just want to take this microphone? Sure. Any other thoughts on that, Greg or Aaron? Did you have any response to that? No? Yeah. Okay, Lisa. Okay.
You may have actually touched on the question I'm going to ask. The good person theory seems to be prevalent in our society, and I have an ongoing debate with my son, who the question is, why isn't a good person going to heaven? And my reply is, he doesn't believe in Christ. But then this really emphasizes the good person, and to me, particularly with children, they're going to go, this doesn't make sense in our mind. You're saying be a good person, what if you don't do this extra? And then working in a multicultural situation as I do, a good person to a Hindu is not a good person to a Muslim, is not a good person to a Christian. So is this all based on the fact that we're all Christians, being a, quote, good person? Please explain how you would explain that to children.
Well, I think my colleagues will want to say something about this too, but let me say something about it, and actually that'll give me an excuse to show you one more slide. So this gets into really views of religious pluralism, and Dallas had a view, and again, Knowing Christ Today is the place to go there. So one way to think about this is that God is on the lookout for good persons, and that good persons can be formed in various ways. And then I won't try to go into details of Dallas's view of this, but at the same time, and this is where I think I can have another slide. Here's another quote. Dallas says, "A really good person, as Jesus teaches, is anyone pervaded by love." And you might think, and I think others can comment on this, but Dallas thought there are ways to be pervaded by love that aren't exclusively Christian ways or ways where people have explicit knowledge of Christ. But then he says, how do you become a really good person? Well, you place your confidence in Jesus Christ and become his student or apprentice in kingdom living. That amounts to progressively entering into the abundance of life he brings us. You learn from him how to live life. So there are ways to become good on Dallas's account that don't involve knowing Christ. And what happens to good people who don't know Christ is an issue of the question of salvation and how God deals with the unevangelized and things like this. But Dallas also simultaneously held that the way to become a really good person involves Jesus. And so Jesus is the way into life with God in such a way that we're transformed in the way that he taught. But he didn't think that non-Christians weren't good people, or that there weren't ways to become pervaded by love, for instance. And so that's one stab at what you're asking.
So there's a Willardism, or a pair of them anyway, that many of you will have heard. But I know that Dallas often, when asked who gets to go to heaven, would say that God will let into heaven anyone who can possibly stand to be there. And that leaves a lot of possibilities wide open. It also reminds us, as Richard was saying, that the fires of heaven can burn pretty hot. And in connection with hell, Dallas didn't think that though everyone who can stand to be there winds up in heaven, I think Dallas didn't think that was everyone. And so when asked about hell, as many of you know, he would say, hell is the very best God can do for people that he loves and want nothing to do with him. And so there's that pair of Willardisms describes for us two broad trajectories through life, a trajectory toward love and toward God, and a trajectory away from God. And I think as Willard thought about it, the afterlife was just an extension of those two trajectories.
So I'll just add that Dallas does very clearly say in Knowing Christ Today, in the context of this quote that's up here on the screen, that a person can in fact be right with God just on the basis of their life being pervaded by love, even if they don't know anything about the historical Jesus. So I think that the gentleman who asked the question, what do you say to a child who's worrying about this? You say, well, actually, God may very well accept that person. That their moral instincts, I think, are right on that point, the children's moral instincts.
And on the business about there being different, culturally specific conceptions of the good person, that was also a really good question, I thought. I think, that you guys may know Dallas better on this, but I think Dallas thought that though there are differences across culture, there is broad agreement that runs across culture about who the really good people are and what a bad person looks like, and what some of the basic things that we ought to do are, things that are obligatory for us, permissible for us, and so forth. There are disagreements, but there's a substantial body of agreement across culture. I think he was convinced of that. Enough agreement to make for robust moral theory of the sort that Aaron was describing. There's also, I know C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man, and then again in That Hideous Strength is the fictional version of it, depicts this very frightening possibility that real moral knowledge could be trained out of the human condition. So you can have a natural, you can be naturally drawn to the good and then educated out of that. You can be educated in such a way that you're now repulsed by the good. So that stands out as a frightening possibility, that the human race could be conditioned or trained out of the basic resources for moral knowledge. But I think Dallas thought, we're not there yet. That hasn't happened. And it's good for us to have that frightening possibility on the horizon, because that's what motivates the project in some ways.
Brad.
Yeah, just on the question of advocacy, part of Dallas's great passion was to talk about regaining knowledge, and the one who knows has the authority to teach. And so I'm thinking about, I understand the process and the person of who Dallas was and how he wanted the person to engage the questions, but it seems to be there has to be a place for advocacy of some sort. And I'm thinking about the implications of preaching. So I wonder if you want to comment on that.
Steve, that might be a question for you.
Well, we keep talking about knowing Christ today, and the last chapter there, pastors as teachers of knowledge, is, I think, the place to go to answer that. So certainly he thought there was a responsibility on the part of pastors to come to have knowledge themselves and then to represent things as they are. I think the point that he's making here is then it becomes a question of how do you best present what you know to be true. And at least in the classroom, as Aaron was kind of intimating, Dallas certainly advocated for positions, but he often tried to help you see the truth for yourself. And so he worked very, very hard with students in the classroom to lead them to have a confrontation with the truth and to see things as they are. And that came out of his phenomenological kind of approach and commitment. But I think it wasn't because he was committed to phenomenology. He just thought that was right. That's what you do. You confront people with the realities as best you can, and then you hope that they will see things as they are. And I think preaching can take that mode as well in a different sort of way, where the pastor is trying to paint a picture of whatever the truth or reality is, and trusting that with God's help, people will see it. And when we try to get people get people to see what we want them to see, and it's more about kind of persuasion, sometimes it works, and sometimes it causes an adverse reaction. So.
I'll just add briefly. I think the quote that Aaron read does leave wiggle room for advocacy. It's something like very rarely and with great care, or something like that. So you might think of this as a last resort. So if you're teaching mathematics, what you really want to do is present the material in such a way that the student comes to see that this is what follows from that. But absent that, and you're running out of time in the class, you might just say, look, you got to take my word for it. This follows from that. Now we're going to now we're going to go. But so sometimes you got to do that, but I think we all recognize it as second best at best.
I would say that it seems to me that whatever room might be there for advocacy, and I think there is some. I mean, certainly in private conversation with each of us, I'm sure Dallas did let us know what his views were when we asked, and it was clear that that's what we wanted. But I think in his theory, the larger part of the work is to be done by the vision, right? If we think about his VIM framework, vision, intention, means this whole developing knowledge about the good person is basically developing a vision for what anyone's life might be like if they have the intention and the means to become that sort of person. And I think he wants the focus in the development of moral knowledge to really be on creating this clear vision of the good person. And then the intrinsic attractiveness of the vision is supposed to be what really does the work in drawing a person to it.
Michael.
Gentlemen, can you help me a little bit with Dallas's moral epistemology? So, we're focusing on the good person, but it still doesn't quite. Just help me with some categories here. It sounds very common sense type, so we've kind of got some sort of knowledge of it in ourselves, but we're also seeing these sort of properties in reality, moral phenomena. And just help me kind of put it together a little bit.
What categories are you looking for, Michael?
Well, just description.
So you don't want like philosophical jargon categories, like is Dallas a deontologist, or what?
I'm good with that too.
Okay.
Something sort of seems to be missing for me. We're in the concrete situation where we're dealing with people in front of us. We're looking for cases of good people. We're obviously not doing this on empirical bases, but do you just sort of see, oh well, Aaron's doing a good thing here, and
So here are two things to say. I think there's a lot to say in response to that. That's a good question. One is that I think when it came to moral knowledge, or just knowledge generally, Dallas was what philosophers and epistemologists call a particularist. And so you don't start with trying to find general rules and then see what they imply for particular cases. You start with particular cases, and then you try to build up general rules as best you can from what you know about the particular cases. And that's a real divide in the philosophical discussion. There are folks on both sides of it. So one very deep thing to say about Dallas's moral epistemology was that he was a particularist and he thought this was, I think Dallas puzzled about G.E. Moore, because G.E. Moore in epistemology generally was one of the great particularists. But when it came to moral knowledge, Moore seems to have abandoned his particularism and gone after something that looked more like a Methodism. So he's a particularist. And then second thing to say is I think for Dallas in his moral epistemology, knowledge by acquaintance takes center stage over propositional knowledge. So there are propositions to be discerned about the moral life, but they're to be derived from knowledge by acquaintance, whereas I think, and here again, there's a real philosophical argument to be had in both directions, but Dallas prized knowledge by acquaintance.
And just to follow up on that briefly, in, again, Knowing Christ Today, Dallas says that there is a fundamental moral intuition that pretty much everyone has, and it has to do with the centrality of agape love to the moral life. He says that good and evil are fundamentally sensed rather than known abstractly. So he has this idea of something like moral perception. So that might be what you're after there, Michael. You know, what's his epistemology? He's there is some sort of ability of moral perception. And of course, his work on Husserl and realist epistemology is going to have a big role to play in explaining just how we can accept the very idea that we can directly perceive moral properties of states of affairs that confront us.
I think that should be the last question. We're kind of a little short on time here, so.
How is this book and his good person theory going to shape apologetics in the way that we talk about the moral arguments and the different worldviews, particularly humanism and their worldview?
Well, because we're being told we're out of time, I'll say two things really quick. One, advertisement for an upcoming session with Greg Ten Elsoff and Jim Taylor on apologetics. And so Greg will take that issue up there.
Okay.
And, but no, it is a very good question. And yeah, I do think, well, maybe I'll just leave it at that, I think, to try to develop any other response. But maybe we can talk after as well.
Okay, and why don't we give our panelists a round of applause?